No matter from what tribe, village, or ethnic group our ancestors have descended, they always had tenable allegiance to the principles thereof. They owed something to their society. What do Americans owe? Moreover, as citizens of the world, again, what do they owe? There are many different ways to view the U.S. Constitution. One of the facets that is very intriguing is that the more you try to work greater liberty for the individual into the affairs of our government, the more you are forced to think of everyone's participation. How can you think of a person as free, then expect them unequivocally to participate? The title of this video is Even Hand, a discourse on the U.S. Constitution using Aristotelian Nicomachean ethics criteria and Lysander Spooner's cooperation amongst equals principles. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was arranged to give the delegates from the 13 states an opportunity to create a better system of government. The delegates decided upon what's called a limited democratic triad. This is a superb attempt at fair government with checks and balances to guard against the occurrence of people taking advantage of the authority of their elected or appointed position. To understand the written power structure for authority the U.S. Constitution details and how it applies to society from a contractual viewpoint, it's important to realize that 57 people attended the Constitutional Convention in 1787. 41 people were present on the last day of the convention. This was the day when the U.S. Constitution was signed. 38 people actually signed the U.S. Constitution and pledged their allegiance by contract to this form of government. 3 people refused to sign on the last day. How then were they obligated to the Constitution if they didn't sign? The answer lies in how this contract of governing principles, the U.S. Constitution, was applied to the millions of people who were living in the original 13 colonies. Look at the contrast of the votes in the state ratifying conventions. As a lover of liberty, the statistics are disturbing. It's clear that in 5 of the 13 states, dissension was dangerously close to denying passage. You will notice that in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, and Rhode Island, the percent of dissent from the vote totals was over 40%. These votes weren't for a policy, but instead for a power structure for authority. The votes were for a way of life. It's incredible that so much dissent was involved. It's prudent to ask 3 questions. 1. For those who voted no at the state ratifying conventions, what safeguards were there to protect their liberty? In other words, how are they liable to the implementation of the U.S. Constitution? Did they give up their right to individual freedom simply because they participated in the state ratifying conventions, casting votes on a win or lose basis? 2. The same might be asked about the individual freedom of the 3 people who were at the Constitutional Convention but chose not to sign. 3. And what about the vast portion of society, then and now, which doesn't seem to care about any type of authority? How is their liberty protected? A speculation is now presented that produced a war so terrible it's hard to comprehend. If the states accepted the Constitution by ratifying it, then it stands to reason that if it became unbearable, they'd be allowed to unratify it. Let's take a look at the votes of the seceding states repealing their ratification of the U.S. Constitution to see how the liberty of humans affects the fate of nations. Remember, these votes are for the unratification of the contract for government, the U.S. Constitution, which was signed by 39 men and ratified at the state ratifying conventions of 1787 to 89. The disturbing fact here is, what of all the folk who wanted to stay in the Union? How was their liberty protected? No person should be subject to political power without their consent. What implies a person's binding consent? A handshake, fingerprint, or a DNA sample? A contract more clearly determines civil agreement, thereby putting into proper context the extent a person's consent to the political power a ruling authority will affect their life. Consider this excerpt from Dr. Viktor E. Frankl's book, Mankind's Search for Meaning. Such widespread phenomena as depression, aggression, and addiction are not understandable unless we recognize the existential vacuum underlying them. This is also true of the crisis of pensioners and aging people. To account for the evils exponentially multiplied by society, such as depression, aggression, and addiction, wouldn't a commitment of honor and fairness of each person's duties, shares, and responsibilities to the governing of their nation, world, fill that existential vacuum at its foundation? If the governing system first takes its citizens for granted, then how easy is it to become disillusioned to one's meaning in life? That isn't honorable or fair to them or ourselves. Completing a contract for a power structure for authority is an act of social integration. Let us keep this in mind as we ask the question, whose contract? A power structure for authority enhances and allows civilization to protect itself, taming society to the benefit of social order. Such power structures should consider freedom and equality, have a coherent system for making and interpreting law, and then should ask every adult person by contract for their allegiance. How else are we to confirm a mature understanding of such integral concepts as we the people and of the people, by the people, for the people? Civilization, like all other words, can be loosely translated or obfuscated so that people really have no idea what it is beyond a general term that has no significance or purpose. Respect for each independent person is conducive to civilization. We can expect that if we respect each individual, they'll in turn be polite, courteous, and mannerful, which is once again conducive to civilization. We don't wish to be the source of our own misery. We should build that respect as we desire civilization. Hence, the reason for signing a power structure for authority as a contract is for the psychological purpose of asking people to exercise their liberty for the human race and commit themselves to civilization over anarchy. Even hand doesn't purport that every action taken by people be bound by contract, simply that by giving people a primary choice we might raise their awareness of the circumstances we are attempting to offset: war, famines, pestilence, economic depression, anarchy, plagues, and addiction. Has anyone ever asked you to be an American? Has anyone asked you personally to be a citizen of your country? To who do you claim allegiance? To who do you trust with your life? These are questions that ultimately lead back to you and not some leader. It's the paradox of liberty that there can be no fair authority that gives consent to play the game besides yourself. If the people in power don't ask, you're morally obligated to get them to ask, or you use your own authority, self-control, to compel yourself to be acquiescent. If you deny the existence of government's right to rule, then you are deluding yourself of the fact that will, might, and power affects your life. Which is the greater felony, taking someone's allegiance for granted or asking them to sign a contract for government sparing no one? We know government is a necessary but evil institution which organizes authority in our lives. Then, is authority a criminal act against individual freedom? That would make participation by a citizen a criminal act. The whole foundation on this discourse is about a life that is participation orientated. A society that has no reference points beyond itself increasingly becomes a merely contractual agreement, says sociologist Peter Berger. The problem with that, he continues, is that human beings will not die for a social contract, and unless people are prepared, if necessary, to die for it, a society cannot long survive. It is that reference point beyond society that is most people's wonder. While I don't know of any seriously regarded modern government that promises to unquenchably satisfy that inherent wonder, I do believe that an idea of a social contract has merit. In fact, you may aptly conclude that the greater part of this discourse is in refutation to Peter Berger's statement. If the people of our armed forces will live, fight, and die to maintain the U.S. Constitution, how much more so if they are each given the opportunity to sign it themselves? Critics may say that even hand amounts to forced witnessing against oneself, thereby breaking the U.S. Constitution's Fifth Amendment and putting a whole new definition to a person's Miranda rights. The destiny of the human race and its authority isn't invisible, it's real. Neither should a person's allegiance be invisible, it is real. People commit to the greater goal of civilization through even hand just by participating. They aren't forced to agree with the prevailing power structure for authority. Without that agreement to be civil first, government second, what is life? Critics may say that the potential for abuse by an even-hand offer, a contract for government, is too great. They may claim, isn't forcing people to sign yes or no a transgression of their individual freedom? Isn't freedom of choice an attorney for complete political neutrality? Why should we force people to choose? Several times we have inferred that the U.S. Constitution outlines a democratic triad. What exactly is a democratic triad? This discourse is not on the actual structure of a democratic triad. This video is to show you a different perspective of the U.S. Constitution. It is very important that you learn what the U.S. Constitution outlines, inasmuch you must know what you are saying yes or no to. One of the problems with the democratic triad as it is practiced in the U.S. today is that voters have no real recourse except to make a better educated vote. Through a contract, politicians who are themselves citizens that signed yes to the contract for government, outlining a specific power structure for authority, and base their political agenda on the support of other people who sign yes, must be oh so sure of keeping their promises. To convince other citizens to sign yes and keep them together long enough to form a cohesive party that would affect the policies of our democratic triad, those yes politicians would have to be immaculate in their ways. I believe that is a proper expectation of our leaders. Patriotism is not an effrontery, while fanaticism is a blight on rationality. Just because a person signs yes to a power structure for authority doesn't imply they are a fanatic. Some people may wish to choose no to our power structure for authority. They might do so for a number of reasons. If a majority of those citizens that choose no are of the type that base their decision on a dislike of our power structure for authority, would that necessarily imply that they're against civilization? No, nor would it imply they're archaic. What if those who choose no become a majority and vote their own representatives into office? Similarly, if those who choose no are a minority, we would have a much more responsible society because every adult you meet on the street, stranger or friend, will have chosen their own allegiance. The only way those who choose no would become a minority if those who choose yes were doing something right. There is a certain amount of classism in the contract. In explanation, the yeses and the nos. Now let's examine this division a little closer. Critics may argue that this classism may lead to persecution, prejudice, and bigotry because of the easy identification of those who choose no. Are you truly afraid that they might be persecuted for daring to say no? I can't tell you your fear is unjustified. I can tell you that the prospect is diminished because of a further aspect of the even-hand contract known as a term of allegiance. Once you sign yes or no, your commitment is for a term of predetermined years, whereupon you're free once again to exercise your liberty and reconsider how you'll sign for the next term. Your yes or no isn't permanent. I suppose that everyone who chooses no will be so influenced by just being asked that they'll think more about their political liability which government bills them for. The fact that they must obey the laws of the land to thrive regardless of who's making them. This bill doesn't necessarily have to be monetary. In a republic of the people, by the people, for the people, this bill may simply be a smidgen of your time, that is, your declaration of allegiance to civilization. You might query, are human beings and their minds so cheap as to be bought for a smidgen of time? Some humans throughout history have thought others were not even worth a smidgen of time. What's your recourse then but to declare your allegiance? That has always been the nightmare of a liberty lover, to lose what they have for something worse. If our representatives of a yes majority are passing bad laws and just plain making life burdensome, then, at their next signing for a term of allegiance, more people may switch and choose no, thereby creating a majority of the enough is enough people to fix the problem. Remember, our government and the even-hand contract will always be open as we wish to be compassionate and civilized while people choose their obligation. Through a term of allegiance, a person's contract with our government isn't indefinite. What does a term of allegiance account for, and what problems arise from its practice? For example, how can people be expected to sign the U.S. Constitution and be liable to subsequent amendments? Do amendments actually change the body of their written power structure for authority? If so, that power is dangerous. People can't be liable for amendments passed after their signature. The contract for government must be fair and practical. When considering the even-hand contract from a legal standpoint, every amendment would null the previous contractee's signature. A whole generation could become alienated by a single amendment. At this point, a compromise is called for. How can we ameliorate the personal contract to the governing principles people would live through with the extremely necessary article provided to our office holders to amend the contract? To account for this apparent discrepancy, please consider the proposal for a term of allegiance. Your signature to the contract, either yes or no, only binds you for a term of years. At that time and at every interval of the term for the rest of your life, you can redecide your status as a citizen. This would be a great democratic indicator to our elected officials as to how well they're attracting people to the practice of good government and the greater destiny of humanity, as evidenced by the percentage of citizens who sign yes versus those who sign no. A term of allegiance buffers a citizen's liability for future amendments. If an amendment is passed during a term of allegiance for which a person has chosen yes, and said person doesn't like that amendment, then, at the time when they next determine their status as a citizen, they may change their signature to no. Not to be so dreary as to promote solely this type of scenario, because it works in the other direction as well. For example, if during a term of allegiance when a citizen has chosen no, and an amendment is passed that person feels greatly improves their government, then, at that time, when they next determine their status as a citizen, they can change their signature to yes. If a person at the initial signing of the contract chooses no and doesn't want to ever participate in our authority again, their choice should be respected. At least we asked. At the end of a term of allegiance, there should be a window of, say, 2 months when the changing of signatures may occur. Otherwise, our government would assume that your signature for the previous term of allegiance is still valid. Theoretically, a person would only have to sign once in their entire adult life. Part of the problem must be laid on our government's allowance of the exploitation of youth and their innocence. When do kids see themselves committing as adults to the governing of our world? One aspect of our modern society that I believe our conscience is truly missing in fulfilling a social cohesiveness is the much heralded rites and passages of antiquity when a youth accepts maturity and the responsibilities of an adult. The U.S. tries to do this with a menagerie of legalized age limits. Wouldn't a contract to the written power structure for authority be a consanguine coming-of-age right? In exchange for all the privileges of adults, they accept the responsibilities of a civilized world. Also, if they commit a crime against civilization in the future, we'd have evidence of the knowledge of civilization. Currently, I have to question whether the people convicted of crimes even know of the goal of civilization. Regardless of their decision through the contract, yes or no, their pride would remain intact because they made their own choice instead of having their allegiance taken for granted. By leveling the legalized age limit across the board, the youth are given ample time to mature rather than staggering their entrance into adulthood with arbitrary age regulations such as these U.S. legal age limits. We should spend some of our prosperity and longevity wisely in training our youth in the art of civilization instead of exploiting them for their innocence and naivety. They should be taught to view adulthood and civilized government as a mature contract of society which is only ethically and morally binding as long as they agree to maintain it. As long as the contract is fair, then our children will respect us. There are also higher legalized age limits in our society. These are mandated in the U.S. Constitution. You must be 35 to be president, 30 to be a senator, and 26 to be a representative. To my knowledge, there's no legal age limit to be a Supreme Court justice. Moreover, that's probably because the experience necessary to be nominated and confirmed implies an advanced age. Because a democratic triad a representative government, there are many people involved in the decision-making process, each with their own degree of faith and belief. No one's belief or faith should be law in a democratic triad. Only a civilized forum and judgment should be the foundation of law. Christian, Muslim, Judaism, Hindu, Buddhism, Shinto, Taoism, Native American, mythology, Greek, Roman, Norse, pagan, or Wiccan. These religions are practiced by the people who profess them. We know they must be kept as best we can from becoming one or another the overriding influence in the policies of our government. The tendency for bigotry is too great when that event happens. The complication arises thusly. How can you be free and equal throughout the world and practice your religion if you're obligated to refrain from mixing your politics with religious observances? The concept of the separation of church and state applies to institutions of church and state, not religious and political values. What balance to be found to respect these values? We hope that we can make a system so fair to you as an independent person that your allegiance to the human race and our civilization will temper your desire to defeat all other beliefs and opinions, soil from which bigotry grows, for a law and order which is fair and equal. The history of America is strewn with prejudice. The allegiance to civilization is our heart. We must all pledge greater allegiance. To do that, we must be fair. If out of fairness we were to extend to the ethnic groups the offer to have their esteemed folks sign the U.S. Constitution as an honest gesture of equality, we'd then be creating a token aristocracy within that community. To some extent, an economic ethnic aristocracy does exist throughout the world. However, that doesn't mean that a progressive free people recognize it as a governing authority. I don't believe that a racially balanced quorum will give us the fairness we need to commit with wholehearted allegiance. The idea that a constitution would be signed only by a racially representative proportion of society is cheap to me. By letting every person have the opportunity to sign the power structure of a governing authority that they'll live through brings fairness to everyone and allegiance right up close to the heart, which means equality of allegiance, not just for our representatives, not just for one ethnic group or another, but for each and every one of us of the human race. We should each be given the opportunity to sign the power structure for authority, or not. The contract will also bring political equality to the primary division of humans, that being women. Did any woman sign the U.S. Constitution? No. Has any of our female fellow citizens been asked to look at the contract of the governing principles they would live through? I doubt it. The difference between the sexes shouldn't be underestimated. Females outnumber males in the world. When cogitating about civilization, a person can see where we have left ourselves liable to hatred, and how close that hatred comes when a woman feels she isn't being treated fairly. The contract asks all adult citizens to consider the contract for government. Considering Lysander Spooner's cooperation amongst equals, then, how do you categorize an equal? At what level do certain groups stop becoming your equal in the political arena and then start becoming the other guy? These groups are comprised of living, thinking people who should be entitled to the principles of even hand. How do you evaluate the material of even hand using Nicomachean ethics? Do you find the material to be excessive, intermediate, or defective in its reasoning, logic, and postulations? If you have concluded that even hand is in excess, good for you. Considering that a free society is the objective of the U.S. Constitution and that the U.S. Constitution is the intermediate, which is equidistant from excess and defective characteristics, even hand is indeed not intermediate. Some governments are indeed excessive. Governments that do not check and balance the relationship between individuality and society tend to trample freedom. Authority that places its genesis in supernatural entities, inanimate entities, or an unrealistic hope for the future, i.e. a dynasty of 10,000 years, without accounting for the mortal human existence, also tend to trample freedom. On the other side of the spectrum, some governments are indeed defective, such as totalitarianism, fascism, and tribal chieftains. These tend to totally disregard individual freedom. There is also the lack of any social order, anarchy, which is also a defective form of government. An intermediate form of government can be considered to be the U.S. Constitution, a free society, largely unchecked allegiance or accountability to supporting a specific governing system. Even hand misses the mark of a free society inasmuch it demands participation. While While even hand is admittedly extreme in the Aristotelian sense of reasoning, it is prudent to explore the parameters of your relationship to the government of the society you live in, keeping in mind that an intermediate or average relationship with government is of the highest virtue. If you do not know what can be termed as excessive in a system of checks and balances, or likewise defective, then, inasmuch the United States is to a significant degree a politically free society which is largely non-aggressive in its demand for allegiance or accountability to supporting a specific governing system, it is a dangerous trap to interpret the intermediate relationship we have with our current system of checks and balances as apathy, or that nobody in the United States cares about their relationship with law and accountability to the society they live in. Please understand the parameters, excessive and defective, and hold fast to the mean of being politically correct, true, and good within your society, your system of checks and balances. We hope that this video, while mentally challenging, was also fun, inasmuch it brings a scent of fresh meat to a system of checks and balances. We all hunger for a beneficial rule, either with a degree of selfishness or magnanimity. Being satisfied with proper food is an intermediate of highest virtue. In this comprehensive discourse, we pray that you were fed with a good meal. Goodbye.